Welcome to the Leadership Zone. Today I have Thomas McCormick with me. We work together in different ways. We engage in different professional activities together. Thomas also helps me and the team out with bringing some ideas to fruition, engaging in communities, creating more relational approaches. And we are going to hand Thomas the hosting rights today, meaning that Thomas is actually going to lead the Leadership Zone. And we're going to have a conversation about some of the things that has come up in what he's noticing in the background of some of the work that's been going on, what questions he has, what types of confusion, myths, curiosities are emerging when he's in the background having conversations around inclusive leadership, inclusion, leadership, people, relationships, all of the things. So today we're going to have to flip the script. So yeah, I nervously hand you over the hosting rights.
Pleasure to be here, Sheila, in your company and presence like it always is. But a pleasure to be on this podcast with you. There's something very different here about just using a formula or using measurements that are predetermined or frameworks. Because there's something difference between what you're saying and like when we learn something, we just try and apply it everywhere without actually having the ability to actually, like, would this come back to something I've heard you say before about not trying to change what people believe, not trying to tell people what to think, but giving people something to think about.
So there are, at the end of the book, right, there is like a set of approaches, models, actions that I have seen historically be helpful, right? But if they're misapplied, they're not helpful. So before we get near me giving you those things, it's actually about you understanding the practices behind them that would ensure that you can decide which approach is effective or which method you're using, that you can assess that. But a step further than that is, yeah, I'm really not trying to tell you what to think. Like, you're not going to get, this is right, that's wrong, this is moral, this is immoral. But you are going to get something to think about in terms of, is the assumption you have about the way you're leading or inclusion working? And here are some reasons it may or may not be working. Have you thought about it from this lens? And if you haven't, then it might give you like a little extra room to your conceptualizing and therefore your behavior later on. But one of my worst nightmares, and like I have this even when I'm lecturing and things, is that everybody would leave and become cookie cutters. And we know some professions where that happens. You do go through a particular model of training and everybody is like matching each other. My aim is that everyone might have shared set of assets that they lean on to think about and to contemplate, including disagree with, but that how they apply them is actually by utilizing their own critical thinking and their own decision making, holding a level of authenticity about who they are in it, but also knowing that they're fulfilling a role and a responsibility in their workplace. And so it's not just all about who you are and what you want, but it's also not just all about the role and responsibilities. There is a tension that we constantly navigate, and most leaders I work with are navigating that all the time. But a lot of the time we say, just do this or just do that, apply this model, that's the decision. In the book and the way I work with people, it's actually about, here are things for you to decide what is going to help you make this decision. Let's give you some solid things to lean on, both industry insights and research-based evidence, and some concepts that I'm offering you to think about. But you will take them to life and do something with them in a way that works for you or not. And that's actually what's important. So it shouldn't look like you all read the same book. It shouldn't look like you've all sung off the same hymn sheet, but it should be that you're able to critically explain how you made your decision, because actually you've done some of the behind the scenes thinking before applying these like tools and techniques. Yeah, and I think that's a game changer, because then I get more interesting feedback from people as well, where they're like, oh, I did this, it didn't work for this reason. And I love hearing for this reason, because now they know next time when this reason occurs, they're going to shortcut that reason and go to the next step. They're not going to repeat that error. But I can't tell them that in a book because everything is contextual. So I love that kind of feedback where people have brought it to life in a contextual way for them and have learned how to shortcut in their context, because they've been thinking about it, not just applying it and saying it works or it doesn't work. They've been understanding, why did it work? Why didn't it work? Like, it allows that curiosity to help find the solution instead of this idea that a model or a tool is the solution. Misapplied, it's not helpful. And we don't do a lot of talking about that in leadership, that actually all these great ideas misapplied are not effective.
Okay, so there's way more room for context, and is what I'm hearing is that there's way more room for people to kind of come up that the way that they see things, feel things, know things is valid, not necessarily correct in this way we must do everything, but it's valid for coming up with and evolving and developing.
Yeah, like that's exactly it. That's why I start with some of my own story to tell people that we devoiding ourselves of ourselves is not helpful. You go everywhere you go. The good baggage, the bad baggage, whatever is with you. So knowing how to work with it is going to let you make better decisions. So the book is giving you supports around that, but you are going to decide how you bring it to life or don't, rather than this is your solution. This is your partner in you finding solutions. And it does have some solutions in it. And what I mean by that is, readers say things like, I feel relief. You know what I mean? Like, I was relieved to read this. So the solution isn't necessarily the tools, but it's actually a way of thinking about it so that there can be more calm with the approach. The reader can have a relationship with the topic that is more effective than before they read the book, but the book helps them then design their own solutions.
Yeah, having read a good chunk of the book so and the way you're speaking about it and get more clarity on it now at the moment, even there's something about letting go of perfectionism, that it's okay to try something different, that your ideas, that it's okay to speak them in somewhere, that it's better to speak them than not speak them. Just even as you're speaking and when I read it, it feels lighter. It's like something's more possible because there isn't a perfect right and a perfect wrong.
Yeah, like, and even in the beginning of the book, I talk about this. I can undo every position I hold because I genuinely just keep learning different positions. I might not agree with them, but I can undo them. So I find it really hard that there's any real truth anywhere. You know what I mean? I think truth is so subjective. So this is not a list of what you should or shouldn't be. It is not a list of what a good inclusive leader is or isn't. It is a conversation that you get to have with a concept that may have not fully landed before or made sense or felt relevant. And you get to decide its relevance and then how you interact with it. And by doing so, even the process is meant to be inclusive, that you are included in the book because of what you do with the book. The book is not the thing that's deciding everything. Now, there is practical things, like I give background, I give research, I define things, there's tools, there's kind of different examples, there's different challenges, but it has been written in a way, that was my aim, that people could let go of this idea that there's one perfect solution. And if it's not that, we're not doing it right. And actually get into some action, which is, what is the approach I'm using that would move us forward? What's the next step? Not like what it should be, or the fantasy of a perfect organization or the perfect leader, or the fantasy of how things should be, but how are they right now? What choices do we have? A bit like the very starting point of this conversation. What's the reality of what I've inherited? What choices do I have to do with it? What am I going to leverage? What can I work with? And how can I make the best of the reality that I'm in, rather than getting really lost in what it should be and therefore doing nothing because we just know it's not right, kind of thing, and then the efforts can be very hypothetical rather than helpful sometimes, and very kind of morally based rather than, and there's nothing wrong, like I have a very moral position on this too, but they can be so morally based that they're ignoring the purpose of the organization, or they're ignoring that not everyone goes to work with that moral position. So how do you work with inclusion? So I talk about those practical things, about bringing it to life in day-to-day things, rather than inclusion being this extra work. It's actually just a way of you doing your job. How can you bring it into your day-to-day work, rather than it being this extra work you do and you say, you do inclusion. It's actually just you do inclusion and how you do your work. That's kind of the focus I try to take.
Yeah. Okay. So when you say organizations, what are you speaking about? Like, is organization just a big company with lots of people in it? Is it,
Yeah.
I guess, what is it through your lens?
So I would say system, except it would be harder for people to understand, right? Conceptualize. But what I mean by organization is, an organization has a group of people together for a reason, to produce something usually. It's a group of people together with some shared purpose. In a private organization, it's usually profit. In a social enterprise, it's social impact. In a university, it might be between like citizens' obligation, government obligations, and educational obligations. Different public, as in government-based organizations, would have different reasons to exist. Charities would have different reasons, but there's a reason that we do some kind of work together. And that's what I mean by organization. But the point is that organizations have boundaries simply because they exist to do something. Unlike other things, like your book club doesn't really exist to do something together. You share time reading the book, but you're not producing something together or creating something together necessarily. You're experiencing something together. Organizations produce something on some level. And so that does have a boundary to it that's different to societal inclusion, for instance, which is every single person in society has a right to be included equally. But in an organization, like I can't decide I'd like to be a solicitor if I'm not trained as a solicitor. There's a boundary on me being included. It's accurate I wasn't included if I want to join and I don't meet the criteria. That's accurate, but that's because it goes against the organization's purpose in some way. The issue we have in most organizations is there are barriers that doesn't go against its purpose, in fact would help its purpose, but they're unconsciously or systemically built in. So people don't understand how that's causing an issue. It's just how we've done things. But there is a difference between societal inclusion and organisational inclusion, because we only belong to organisations and enter organisations when we contribute to the purpose of it in some form. Whereas
Okay.
society, we have a right to be included because we exist in it.
Yeah, that's a difference. Like, is there any places, Sheila, where they collide, where an organization is trying to do something for society and society's
Yeah.
like, because I get confused over that kind of thing.
Yeah, universities have had massive clashes with this because of the historical history of universities, and then as in because they were often seen as a society kind of like producer, you know, the thinkers of society and the doers. And now there's a bit more, and I don't want to throw around terms that get thrown around a lot, but you know, there's neoliberalism, and there's a bit more kind of capitalism coming in to how people view universities and how people experience them. It's not that they can't cross, right? I just want to be really clear. It's not that they can't cross. And they do cross because we live in society. They're not that far apart. But the issue is, if I have a view of being included in society as a person and I bring it into the organization and it's not relevant, that can be an issue. So what I mean by that is, if I'm advocating for something in society because I believe in something, and my job is making tea, and I now spend 20 hours of my 40-hour job not making tea, which is actually the value that I directly add to the organization. And I spend 20 hours doing something that, you know, or motivating something or trying to change something that I haven't integrated into making tea in some way, which is the actual thing I'm adding to. I'm now adding less value unless the organization has given me a role to do that. And what can happen is people can get caught on social justice movements that are deeply important. Do not get me wrong, deeply value them. The issue is they can get caught on them and they may not be applicable in that workplace for whatever reason. So it's not even that the workplace doesn't agree with that position. It's that conversation within the workplace may not lend to the workplace achieving its purpose. So examples of this is like different conversations on war currently going on in some organizations. And the issue is there's no issue with those conversations occurring because they're important things. But some organizations that are formalizing them are then having issues because they're then having to pick a side in a war, and people are dying, and there is no good side when people are dying. And now your staff are distressed and preoccupied with something that they're trying to have an impact on. And I don't mean like fundraising, I mean like it's become part of an actual argument in the workplace, and people are arguing and falling out over it, and the tea isn't being made or it hasn't been linked to the job. So it's becoming this kind of distraction rather than support. And that doesn't mean that we don't go into workplace and say, I want to have a fundraiser for this, or I want to do this, or I want to do that. But what can happen is, because we have nowhere in society to go with it, we can put it into the organization. And more importantly than anything, it usually harms the individual doing that more than anyone. What ends up happening is that individual often gets rejected, gets kind of labeled as the person doing that, or gets kind of avoided or becomes less influential, not because they weren't doing their best, but because that nuance they didn't pick up on and didn't realize that they were spending their own social capital on that then may not be lending to the outcome that they want. So they might not be achieving what they want anyway. Now they're also losing capital and energy, and they're already traumatized and hurt and harmed, because most of us who get active about something have a connection to it, like even if it's just emotionally. So it is not a light thing to carry a social justice issue and then bring it into the workplace and hope the workplace engages with it, and then find that it's outside the remit or not being engaged with well, or you know, it's becoming something that's separate to the purpose of that organization in that moment, but isn't having the positive impact. Like if it has a positive impact, there's no issue, there'll be no rejection. But it often doesn't, and we don't talk about that honestly sometimes because we believe in the social justice work. You know what I mean? The people doing this, we believe in it. The issue is it's not always effective because of lots of different factors. And that's kind of what I try to bring up in the book is, how are you deciding where to place your energy, how to place it, and the outcome you expect? You can get more of an immediate response in an organization, we'll say around war, because people will often agree that it's awful and be involved in some way. But on the flip side, that doesn't mean you're changing what's happening in terms of the war. So you're still carrying that weight that isn't changing in society necessarily, or isn't moving, but you're trying to make a change internally, which may not be sustainable or practical or helpful or relevant sometimes. I prefer to talk people through that. I haven't written a lot about it in the book, but I pointed to it. I prefer to talk with people about that, because what ends up happening is it can be misconstrued as me suggesting we shouldn't be socially active in our organizations, which isn't what I'm suggesting. However, I'm suggesting that there is a cost to being, and we might not always consider how we're making those decisions, you know, whether we're having the impact we want or we're just letting off steam. That's what I want people to consider is this really a place for me to send these very difficult feelings and feel helpful and useful and all of the things, or am I going to have the impact I want? They're slightly different, and we don't always assess that up front.
Hey, so I feel this could be like a little short segue, possibly into being your authentic self and how it might be heard and the impact that might have on someone or an organization and the nuances that come with that. Like I was like, oh, I needed to hear that a couple of years ago. At one point I was like, I need to be my authentic self every single room I walk into. So just
Oh,
wondering what that means.
yeah. So like I've written two books and the series is an authentic journey, right? Was on self-care, one was on codependency. Before I say anything, I believe authenticity is deeply valuable, right? I do not believe everyone else is responsible for you expressing yourself authentically. And I also don't believe everyone else deserves it. And what I mean by that is in a workplace, we say authenticity, but the reality is what we mean is if you're authentic and not racist, because there's laws in different countries that if you're racist and you're expressing that at work, you've probably discriminated and it's considered a code of conduct issue. So we talk about authenticity, but what we imagine when we talk about authenticity is like somebody being all of themselves, right? Psychologically speaking, anybody is authentic. You know what I mean? As if it's a stagnant position. Were you authentic at 20? Were you authentic at 30? Or were they versions of your authenticity? The other thing is authenticity is not being the same in every room because it's not because I'm inauthentic, there's a golden thread, but it's because there's an appropriateness for the setting. And what I will say is a lot of the movement around inclusion to say, be authentic, bring your whole self to work was well intentioned, right? It meant what they were trying to say was those of you who have to mask, we want to make this a workplace where you don't have to mask. So that's what they meant by authenticity and whole self, right? Unfortunately, the reality is not everyone was masking. So what did that mean to everyone? Well, it started to mean all sorts of interesting things. The reality is we want workplaces where you do not have to hide or mask something to be safe and effective, because when you're masking, it takes up energy, gets in the way of creativity, innovation, flow, and performance, right? It's a problem. It's an extra weight you're carrying. And in the workplace, it doesn't help you or the workplace or relationships. Authenticity is an evolving relationship with oneself. And then that may inform how you show up in the world. But this idea of bring your whole self to work and be authentic is really dodgy. There are some legal cases that tell us that. There's a case where somebody was told, bring your authentic self, be authentic. If people make mistakes, we'll sort them. Somebody made a mistake, got fired. They said a racist comment, they got fired. They not only got their job back, they got compensation for the humiliation because they were told be authentic. They were then authentic, and then the authenticity was rejected. So when we say authentic, we leave ourselves open to a lot of issues, legally speaking, in organizations. And we're not really imagining the racist, bigoted, homophobic, sexist, ableist person. We're imagining like the fantasy of the perfect person being authentic and free and comfortable. So authenticity, you can't say be authentic and then say, but only these people, because like do the maths. But what you can say is we want this to be a place where you don't need to mask. We want this to be an environment where you can focus on the work rather than trying to feel unsafe and have to protect yourself in some additional ways to others without those barriers. We want people to be authentic, but actually that's a personal responsibility. That's your job. I can't make you authentic. There's nothing worse than when someone says, well, and as a coach, Thomas, you'll know this too, that's just how I am. And they're trying to pretend that that's authentic. And you're like, no, that's a defense. Authenticity is at an essence level in your relationship with yourself. It is not when it is being used to excuse behavior. Like you can't say be authentic and here's our code of conduct, because all I have to say is, well, that's not authentic to me. So which one is it? So
Yeah.
let's say what we mean rather than shortcutting it. And what I mean is I want this to be a workplace where you don't have to mask yourself or hide parts or be distracted by will you be good enough because of differences that you have to others. But we have boundaries that are legally implementable based on discrimination legislations and the, Equality Act and things. But also, if you don't want to be authentic, like that's your right as well in any setting. If you don't want to do the work of learning who you are, whatever, that's none of my business. Like that's your job. My job is that the environment you're in doesn't require you to hide parts of your identity because you would be treated as less than. But also it's my job to make sure that, as in if you're a leader or manager, that you are not behaving in a way that infringes on anyone's rights as well. So if your authenticity is racist, that's not appropriate. If it's sexist, you can believe what you want, but in work, you must behave, communicate, and complete your task in a way that honors the policies and procedures that we've agreed on here. So you do sign up to some kind of code in an organization, both physically when you sign your contracts, but also, I would say, energetically. We kind of agree to a lot of things unconsciously by how we adapt and behave. So yeah, so authenticity, I love it. I think it's important. It's not your workplace's business whether you are or you aren't. It's their job to make sure that they're not creating a hostile environment for you, that you have to hide your identity to be treated as an equal, valid human being. But also it's the workplace's responsibility to have boundaries around what's acceptable here, which may not align with your authenticity. But if you agree to it, then you have to work with it. And if you decide that it's not for you, you have to work with it. Like, there's always a cost to our agreements, whatever we agree to. Yeah, I think that's away from the fantasy of like harmony, which a lot of people think inclusion is harmonious. It can't be, because it requires differences. It's the ability to work well together through differences, through challenges, through disagreements. And so authenticity is not this like Pollyanna situation. In fact, it's not very helpful. What's much more helpful is talking about masking, ensuring that discrimination isn't happening, creating safe environments to work. But that doesn't mean that you can bring your whole self to work. Like, you don't want Monday morning 7 a.m. me coming into work, like, or you don't want exhausted from family argument me bringing all of that in. Like, while that will be part of my experience, and I might need you to be gentle with me, and I might need to say, now it's been a tough week or something happened, give me a break. What you don't want is me coming in and spilling that everywhere and calling it authenticity, when it's actually just a lack of emotional regulation, or usually a lack of emotional regulation responsibility for how I'm going to impact others in this environment as well. Yeah.
I get to have the last word. Lovely. In my own mind, I guess I'm wondering, honestly, I'm thinking of just so many different experiences and people, and I think everyone wants to do their best. And it can be so hard to do your best when there's so many realms of information and so many experts and different things. So a part of me is like, wow, there's something with this book and your work that alleviates some of that pressure. It doesn't take away the effort that needs to be done to move forward, but it takes away some of the pressure, brings more humanness in. And I think what was coming to me, it makes like there's something, it's about building skills to be more okay in the messy middle, even if things aren't okay.
Yeah.
I think we all like to jump over the tough stuff at times. Is quite human. I guess that's what coming to me. And then around organizations, like there was a point when I thought organizations is just this big fancy building in the distance that a lot of other people work in. But like the organizations are a place where people come together for a purpose or a cause.
I like it. I'm going to leave you with the last word. Notes and connections to contact Thomas will be in the notes description. So you might be like, oh my God, something resonated about the way Thomas was thinking or asking questions or facilitating the conversation. You can get in contact. He does lots of different pieces of work. So I just want to say that, he gets involved in a lot of creative pieces of work and does some individual private coaching as well as some group stuff. So you might have kind of resonated and want to follow up with Thomas, and I highly recommend that you do. Thank you for listening.